So you think the Colosseum was only dangerous for the gladiators? Think again. Turns out, just showing up as a spectator could get you seriously hurt or worse. And here's the kicker. The richer you were, the more likely you were to end up in danger. Yeah, it sounds backward, right? This is one of those wild things they don't teach you in history class. Going to the games wasn't just entertainment in ancient Rome. It was literally taking your life into your hands. Let me break this down for you. The Romans had a system because of course they did. The front row seats, known as the podium, were reserved for the elite. Senators, high-ranking officials, and the famous Vestal virgins. Basically, the top 1% of Roman society. Makes sense so far. Important people get the best seats. That's how things usually work. But here's where it gets interesting. In Rome, your seat wasn't just about watching the games. It was a flex, a status symbol. Where you sat told everyone just how powerful you were. The closer to the arena, the more impressive you looked. Sitting front row was like walking around with a neon sign flashing, "Yeah, I run this place." So naturally, all the high rollers wanted to be right up front. I'm talking like 15 feet away from the actual arena floor. That's not nosebleed seats. That's practically in the ring. You could see, hear, and even smell everything happening. These seats were called the prima cavea, the prime zone. The most prestigious seats in the entire Coliseum. Honestly, it sounds kind of amazing. Marble seats, servants bringing you wine, the best view in the house for the biggest spectacle in the ancient world. Sounds like a VIP dream, right? But here's where it gets weird. When Roman writers talked about these podium seats, they kept using this one word, immersive. They said sitting there made you really feel what was happening, that it was nothing like sitting further away. Immersive. Strange choice of words for watching people fight to the death, but there's a reason they used it. And it's not just poetic flair. The Romans actually stationed doctors around the podium section, and no, not for the gladiators. The doctors were there for the audience. That's right. Rome had the most advanced entertainment venue the world had ever seen, perfectly engineered, symbolizing Roman power and precision. But in all that planning, they forgot one crucial detail. If you sit close enough to chaos, at some point, chaos doesn't care that you're just watching. And that chaos, it usually started in the mornings. You see, Roman games weren't just about gladiator battles. The day usually kicked off with wild animal shows, exotic creatures shipped in from every corner of the empire, lions from North Africa, bears from Germania, leopards from Persia. All of these animals were kept in cages below the arena, hundreds of them, all jammed into underground pens, dark and loud and confusing. Then, one by one, they were released through trapdoors in the arena floor, straight into the action. And in theory, the Romans had thought of everything. They had trenches dug around the arena, wooden fences, hidden doors, all designed to control the animals, keep them in place, keep the humans safe. But here's the thing. Wild animals don't care about Roman architecture. Those lions and bears weren't trained performers. They were freaked out, hungry, angry, and jammed into tiny cages for weeks before showtime. Then they get released into an arena with 50,000 screaming Romans. Bright sun, new smells, and chaos. Sometimes they just snapped. Roman writers often describe the morning animal shows as unpredictable or surprising, and that's always a red flag, because when historians use vague words like that over and over, it usually means something went very wrong, and they're trying not to say it outright. And yeah, things went wrong. A lot. The trenches, it's not always deep enough. The fence is not always sturdy. And the people operating the trapdoors, sometimes they just flat out messed up. These safety barriers might have worked fine on a calm day. But when you've got a panicked lion that's never seen a crowd before, all bets are off. And guess who was sitting closest to the chaos? Yep, our Togaring elite. The very people who paid the most for the best seats were now in the danger zone. Because here is a fun fact about panicked animals. They always go for the gladiator. Sometimes they bolt for easier targets, like the fancy guys in the front row sipping wine and trying to look important. But as terrifying as the animals were, they weren't the biggest threat. That came later, in the afternoon when the gladiators took the stage. Let's paint the picture. You're a Roman senator. You've had your morning wine. You're lounging in your marble seat. Below you, two seasoned gladiators are going at it with deadly weapons. It's all very exciting. Until you realize that sword fight is happening inches away from your face. These guys aren't stage fighting. This isn't choreography. They're trying to kill each other. And here's the thing. When someone gets stabbed or slashed with a Roman sword, it's messy. Blood sprays, bones break. Body parts don't stay where they're supposed to. Gravity, good old reliable gravity, means all that mess has one direction to go. Downward, right? Toward the podium. The different types of gladiators made it even worse. You had the heavily armored murmillos, the nimble retieri with their nets and tridents. Each brought different weapons, different attack styles, and different risks. And sometimes those gladiators would dedicate their fights to people in the stands, like an ancient version of this one, S for you, which meant they'd get closer to those specific sections, closer to the elite, closer to you. Nice gesture, right? Unless you're the guy getting splattered with blood every time a sword swings a little wide. And these weren't surgical tools. Roman swords broke, net weights slipped. Tridents with their 3 long, sharp points were notorious for flying out of sweaty hands mid-fight. And then there's the debris bits of armor, broken weapons, even chunks of flesh. All of that, flying around like shrapnel in a war zone. Sure, the Romans built impressive drainage systems to handle all the blood. They had crews to rake fresh sand over the gore between fights. But no matter how advanced your architecture is, it can't protect you from physics. When violence is happening that close, you're not a spectator anymore. You're part of the action. And yet, that still wasn't the most horrifying part of the day. Because just wait until you hear about execution hour. So, if you thought blood spraying from gladiator fights was the worst part, just wait. Because the real horror show didn't start until midday. That's when the Romans brought out their halftime entertainment, public executions. Yeah, actual executions. They weren't just killing criminals. They turned it into theater. Think of it like Broadway, but instead of singing and dancing, someone got mauled by a bear. And the audience couldn't look away. Literally. See, if you were a Roman senator, or a magistrate, or held any public office, you were required to attend. You had to sit in your fancy seat right up front and bear witness to Roman justice. Even if that justice meant watching someone be torn apart 15 feet from your face, it wasn't optional. It was civic duty. Your presence proved your loyalty to the empire and your tolerance for extreme violence. And the Romans, oh, they got creative. They didn't just line people up and execute them. No, they put on full productions. Elaborate reenactments of mythology, but with real people and very real deaths. You'd have prisoners playing roles like Orpheus, getting ripped apart by animals, or Icarus, getting burned alive with real fire. Real screams, real charred bodies. They even had costumes and props. It was all part of the performance. And these weren't just random criminals either. Sometimes the victims were political prisoners. Former allies who had fallen out of favor, nobles who backed the wrong emperor, which means if you were sitting in the podium section, odds are you recognized the person being executed. You might have shaken hands with them at a Senate meeting last year. Maybe you went to their villa for dinner. Now you're watching them scream in agony while being mauled by leopards, and you're supposed to clap. The executions were designed to be as gruesome and humiliating as possible. Maximum blood, maximum spectacle, maximum message. It wasn't just punishment, it was a warning. It's a brutal reminder that Rome held all the power. And those prime seats? The ones for the rich and powerful? They were right in the splash zone. Roman writers actually tried to put a spin on it. They described these events as educational for the elite. That watching the executions taught important lessons about law, justice, and Roman strength. Yeah, educational. Like, here's what happens if you mess with the system. But you can tell from their writing that not everyone bought into the propaganda. Some senators would suddenly get sick and leave during the executions. Others claimed urgent Senate business just happened to come up right when the lions came out. Anything to get away from the carnage. Because let's be real, when you're watching someone you know get ripped apart and their blood is soaking through your expensive toga, that stays with you. You don't forget that. But believe it or not, the animals, the gladiators, the executions, none of that was the most dangerous part of the day. You know what was? The crowd. 50,000 Romans, packed into a giant stone bowl, cheering, screaming, betting money, yelling insults, throwing things, and sometimes turning violent. See, Roman crowds were passionate. They had favorite gladiators, hometown pride, and lots of money riding on the outcome. So when a fight didn't go the way they liked, things could go south, fast. Take what happened in Pompeii in 59 AD. A simple gladiator match between local fighters and visitors from another town should have been routine. Instead, it turned into an all-out riot. Fans started throwing rocks, then knives. Dozens of people died, and not in the arena, but in the stands. It was so bad, the emperor banned all gladiator games in Pompeii for 10 years. Now imagine that same energy. Inside the Coliseum, with its steep seating levels, tight staircases, and very few exits, when a riot broke out, there was nowhere to run. And guess who got trapped in the worst place? The rich folks in the podium seats. Here's why. Those front row VIP sections had private tunnels, separate entrances from the rest of the crowd. It was meant to be luxurious, exclusive, but during a panic, it became a death trap, because those exits didn't connect to the upper levels. So when people in the cheap seats freaked out and started stampeding, all that chaos poured downward. Imagine being stuck between a stone wall and a wall of terrified people crushing toward the exits. There's nowhere to go, there's no escape, and it gets worse. When riots broke out in the higher levels, people started throwing anything they could get their hands on, stones, wooden planks, even burning torches. All of it came raining down on the people sitting below. Again, that's the rich, the elite, the ones who paid the most to be there. All trapped, all targets. It's ironic, right? The podium was supposed to be the most honorable place to sit. Instead, it was one of the most dangerous. But if you're thinking, all right, at least the poor folks in the upper seats were safe, not so fast. Because being high up had its own terrifying risks. So far, we've talked about how the richest people in Rome got the worst of the blood. Chaos and crowd violence down in the front row. But what about the folks up top? Poor citizens, the commoners. They weren't exactly safe either, in fact. Sitting higher up came with a whole different list of ways to die. Let's start with the obvious. The upper levels of the Colosseum were made mostly of wood. Not marble, not stone. Wooden beams, wooden seating, wooden supports, all baking in the Mediterranean sun. Packed with thousands of sweating bodies, lit by oil lamps, surrounded by heat and noise. You don't need to be an architect to guess what went wrong. Fires. One little spark, a dropped torch, a broken lamp, a careless smoker, and the whole upper section could light up like a bonfire. And it did. Fires weren't just a risk, they were an ongoing problem. Roman engineers were brilliant, but even they couldn't fully fireproof a wooden structure packed with 50,000 people. And it wasn't just fire. Those top tiers were structurally unstable, especially during packed events when they crammed in more people than the building was ever designed to hold. Weight limits, not really a thing in ancient Rome. All that pressure, people packed shoulder to shoulder, stomping, cheering, moving. It pushed the Colosseum's structural limits past the breaking point. Wooden beams cracked, support posts shifted, and sometimes entire sections just gave way. No warning, no safety net. Just a sudden collapse crushing anyone sitting below and sending the people on top tumbling down like dominoes. You'd think that being high up meant you had distance from the danger. But in reality, it was just a different kind of nightmare. And let's not forget the heat. Rome gets hot. In the summer, the Colosseum would turn into a stone oven. 8 hours in the blazing sun with no shade. It was brutal. The Romans did try to do something about that. They built this massive awning system, the velarium, to give the audience some shade. But even that was a problem, because that awning, it was made of heavy cloth, held up by ropes and wooden poles, and operated by sailors from the Roman Navy. Yeah, actual sailors, hired to control the system. And every time they raised or lowered it, there was a risk of collapse. Poles snapped. Ropes tore. Shade turned into falling debris. People got injured, sometimes killed. And then there's what happened when animals escaped because, yes, even with all their barriers and planning, wild animals did get loose. And when that happened, they didn't always run toward the exits or the arena walls. Sometimes they ran up, terrified, disoriented. Just looking for any way out, some leopards and lions actually climbed up the arena wall, bolting straight for the upper tiers. So while the rich were dodging claws and teeth in the front row, The poor were suddenly staring down a full-grown predator charging right at them in a space with nowhere to run. There were no personal seats in the upper levels, no aisles, no spacing. People were packed in tight, like sardines, with no real evacuation plan. And when things went bad, it was chaos. Bodies piled up. People trampled each other trying to escape. If the wooden supports held, great, you got out. If they didn't, you went down with them. So here's the big picture. Whether you were rich or poor, senator or servant, the Colosseum wasn't just a stadium. It was a death trap wrapped in marble and spectacle. The Romans built the most awe-inspiring arena the world had ever seen. But they filled it with every possible way to die, and then invited the public in to watch it all unfold. And yet, people kept showing up. Every day, every event. 50,000 Romans packed the seats again and again. Why? Because violence wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Rome didn't just tolerate blood, it celebrated it. For the elite, showing up proved your loyalty and your courage. For the poor, it was a chance to see something extraordinary, to escape the grind of daily life and watch gods and monsters battle before your eyes. It was power, it was fear, it was Rome. And as dangerous as it was, one thing was always true. If you were in the Colosseum, you weren't just a spectator, you were part of the show.